For 50 years, we've been told a story about human nature, a story that appears in every psychology textbook, cited in courtrooms, invoked to explain everything from corporate fraud to military torture. The story goes like this. In August 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo transformed the basement of Stanford University into a prison. He recruited 24 normal, healthy college students. With a coin flip, some became guards, others became prisoners. Within days, the guards turned sadistic. The prisoners broke down. The experiment spiraled so far out of control that Zimbardo had to shut it down after just 6 days. The lesson seemed clear. Put good people in a bad situation, and they become monsters. It's not about who you are. It's about where you are. The situation, not the person, determines behavior. But what if the story we've been told is a lie? Tonight is not about theory. It's about what governments, scientists, and institutions were willing to do when they believed no one would ever find out. This is about documents buried in archives, recordings that contradict official narratives, participants who finally broke their silence. Summer 1971. America is tearing itself apart. Vietnam rages on. 4 students have been shot dead at Kent State. The nation's prisons are powder kegs of violence. Just months before Zimbardo's experiment, the deadliest prison uprising in American history erupted at Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York. 43 people died. The images shocked the nation. Politicians demanded answers. Why were prisons so violent? Was it the criminals inside, or something about the prisons themselves? This was the question Philip Zimbardo wanted to answer. A rising star at Stanford University, Zimbardo had built his reputation studying how situations shape behavior. He had funding from the U.S. Office of Naval Research. The military wanted to understand conflict between guards and prisoners. The setup seemed scientifically rigorous. An advertisement ran in 2 Palo Alto newspapers. Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life. $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. 75 men responded. Zimbardo's team put them through extensive screening personality tests, psychiatric evaluations, medical exams, background checks. They wanted to ensure these were normal, healthy, stable individuals. No criminal records, no psychological problems, no history of drug abuse. 24 were selected. These were not troubled youth. They were mostly middle-class college students, many of them pacifists. On paper, they represented the best of American youth. Then came the random assignment, the cornerstone of scientific credibility. A coin flip determined who became guards and who became prisoners. Pure chance, no bias. This randomization was supposed to prove that any differences in behavior could only be attributed to the roles themselves, not to the individuals. Or so we were told. Sunday, August 14, 1971. The experiment begins not in a basement, but in the real world. The Palo Alto Police Department, working with Zimbardo's team, conducts actual arrests. Squad cars pull up to homes across the city. Officers knock on doors. Young men, still in their pajamas, are handcuffed, read their Miranda rights, and taken to the police station. They're fingerprinted, photographed, booked on charges of armed robbery and burglary. Their confusion is real. Their humiliation is documented by a local television crew that Zimbardo has invited to witness the spectacle. This is not standard scientific procedure. This is theater. The prisoners are transported to Stanford County Jail, a mock prison constructed in the basement of the psychology building. They're stripped naked, searched, geloused with a spray, given ill-fitting smocks with numbers printed on them, no underwear, rubber sandals, a chain locked around one ankle. The message is clear. You are no longer a person. You are a number. Meanwhile, the guards receive their uniforms. Khaki shirts and pants, whistles, handcuffs, billy clubs, and mirrored sunglasses, so the prisoners can never see their eyes, so they can hide behind anonymity. But here's what we weren't told for decades. The guards received more than uniforms. They received instructions. On the evening before the experiment began, what Zimbardo would later call Day Zero, the guards attended an orientation meeting. What happened in that room would remain hidden for nearly 50 years. Day one passes relatively uneventfully. The prisoners are settling in, some joking, trying to make the best of it. The guards are still feeling their way into their roles. But by day two, something changes. The prisoners stage a rebellion. They barricade themselves in their cells using their beds. They taunt the guards. They rip off their prisoner numbers. This is the moment Zimbardo has been waiting for. This is where the experiment becomes dramatic, where science becomes spectacle. The guards respond with force. They spray fire extinguishers through the cell bars. They strip prisoners naked. They force them to do push-ups. They create a privileged cell, rewarding cooperative prisoners with their clothes back, creating division and suspicion. This is when the famous photographs are taken. Prisoners lined up against walls, bags over their heads, chained together. Images that will become iconic. And this is when prisoner 8612 Douglas Corby has his breakdown. 36 hours into the experiment. After time in solitary confinement, a converted closet Corby begins screaming, "Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside. I can't stand another night. I just can't take it anymore." Zimbardo releases him. This becomes Exhibit A in the official narrative. Proof that normal people, placed in these roles, experience genuine psychological trauma. Except Douglas Corby now says he was acting. July 2014, Sorbonne University researcher Tibale Texier arrives at Stanford University's Special Collections Library. He's been given access to the Philip G. Zimbardo papers boxes and boxes of documents that have sat, largely unexamined, for decades. Leigh Texier came to Stanford as a fan. He wanted to make a documentary celebrating the experiment. He left questioning everything. What he found in those archives would fundamentally challenge 50 years of accepted psychological truth. First, the guards' orientation meeting on day zero. Leigh Texier discovered the transcript. Here's what Zimbardo told the guards. You can create in the prisoners feelings of boredom, a sense of fear to some degree. You can create a notion of arbitrariness, that their life is totally controlled by us, by the system, you, me, and they'll have no privacy. We're going to take away their individuality in various ways. In general, what all this leads to is a sense of powerlessness. That is, in this situation, we'll have all the power and they'll have none. This was not observation. This was direction. Zimbardo was telling the guards exactly how to behave to produce the results he wanted. Second, the guards received written instructions, a schedule of activities, rules to enforce, suggestions for psychological tactics. They weren't blindly falling into roles, they were following a script. Third, the experiment had a precedent. 3 months earlier, an undergraduate class at Stanford ran a nearly identical mock prison experiment. Students played guards and prisoners. The tactics that would become famous in Zimbardo's study, the psychological abuse, the power plays, were tested in that earlier experiment. Zimbardo never disclosed this in his publications. He presented his experiment as spontaneous, organic. But the playbook already existed. Most damning of all, Texier found evidence that the guards knew they were being studied. They knew what results were expected, and many of them were deliberately performing to meet those expectations. There was another person involved in the Stanford Prison Experiment, someone whose role has been minimized in the official narrative. Carlo Prescott, an ex-convict who had served 17 years in California's most notorious prisons, San Quentin, Soledad, Folsom. Prescott had just been paroled when Zimbardo invited him to consult on the experiment. Prescott taught Zimbardo what prison was really like, the psychological tactics, the ways guards dehumanize prisoners, The techniques used to break a person's spirit. Many of the most shocking elements of the Stanford Prison Experiment, putting bags over prisoners' heads, chaining them together, using buckets as toilets, came directly from Prescott's experience in real prisons. During the experiment, Prescott served as the head of the parole board. Prisoners who wanted to leave had to appear before him. And Prescott, falling deep into his role, became the kind of authority figure he had always hated. He denied parole requests. He berated prisoners who begged to leave. Some cried. Some broke down. Prescott later said the experience made him physically ill. He realized he had become the very thing he despised. In 2005, an op-ed appeared in the Stanford Daily newspaper titled "The Lie of the Stanford Prison Experiment." It was credited to Carlo Prescott. In it, the author claimed that the guards had been explicitly instructed on how to behave, that the experiment was staged to produce predetermined results. Zimbardo's response was immediate. Prescott didn't write that op-ed. It was written by Michael Lazaru, a Hollywood producer who had failed to secure the movie rights to the experiment. But when reporters tried to contact Prescott to verify, Zimbardo sent threatening emails. "Cease and desist from calling Carlo Prescott," he wrote in capital letters. "I shall be taking this case to my lawyer soon." Prescott never definitively confirmed or denied authorship. He refused to speak about the experiment. And so the question remains, what really happened in that basement? And who was directing the performance? For decades, Douglas Corpy's breakdown was the most cited evidence of the experiment's psychological impact. Footage of him screaming, crying, demanding to leave. This was proof that the situation had overwhelmed a normal person. But in 2017, Corpy told a different story. He explained that he had signed up for the experiment thinking it would be easy money. He planned to spend the time studying for the graduate record examination. He'd bring his books, sit in a cell, and prepare for his future. But when he asked for his study materials, the guards refused. When he asked to leave, Zimbardo told him they were making history and that he couldn't quit. That's when Corpy realized he was trapped. The contract he'd signed meant nothing. The researchers weren't going to let him leave. So he decided to act crazy. He was locked in solitary confinement, the hole, a converted closet. And there, in the darkness, he made a choice. If they wanted drama, he'd give them drama. Anybody who is a clinician would know that I was faking. Corpy said in 2017, "If you listen to the tape, it's not subtle. I'm not that good at acting. I was doing my impression of a crazy person from movies." It worked. Zimbardo released him. But Corpy's performance became the centerpiece of the experiment's narrative. Proof of psychological breakdown. Evidence that situations can destroy even healthy minds. Zimbardo's response to Corpy's revelation? He's ashamed of having broken down. Retrospectively now, he's trying to rewrite history. He is the least reliable source of any information about the study. But there's a problem with that explanation. In 2024, National Geographic released a 3-part documentary featuring interviews with the original participants. Multiple prisoners confirmed that they felt trapped, that their attempts to leave were denied or discouraged, that they were performing to get out. And then there were the guards. Dave Eshelman became the most notorious guard in the Stanford Prison Experiment. His cruelty was legendary. He forced prisoners to simulate sodomy. He invented new humiliations. He became, in Zimbardo's narrative, the perfect example of how a normal person becomes a sadist. But Eshelman later admitted he was inspired by a character in Cool Hand Luke, a prison film he'd recently watched. He was playing a role, deliberately crafting a performance. "I was kind of running my own experiment," Eshelman explained. "I wanted to see what it would take to break someone. I wanted to see if I could do that through role-playing." Eshelman had a theater background. He understood performance, and he understood what the researchers wanted to see. Other guards reported similar awareness. They knew they were in an experiment. They knew the cameras were rolling. They knew Zimbardo and his team were watching from an observation room. And they knew, either explicitly or implicitly, what kind of behavior would make the experiment successful. This is called demand characteristics, when research participants behave in ways they think the experimenter wants them to behave. It's the death of scientific validity. But here's what makes the Stanford Prison Experiment unique. The demand characteristics weren't subtle. They were explicit. Zimbardo told the guards what to do. He gave them schedules. He provided them with tactics. He encouraged escalation. And when things got out of hand, when the abuse became too extreme, Zimbardo didn't stop it. Because he wasn't just the principal investigator. He was also the prison superintendent. He had stepped into the very system he was supposedly studying. The most puzzling question about the Stanford Prison Experiment is not why it was flawed. It's why it remained influential for 50 years despite those flaws. Criticisms emerged almost immediately. In 1973, just 2 years after the experiment, the American Psychological Association investigated, but they concluded that the study met existing ethical standards that would soon change specifically because of experiments like this one. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, methodological critiques appeared. Researchers pointed out the lack of control groups, the absence of double-blind procedures, the small sample size, the demand characteristics, but the experiment persisted. It appeared in every psychology textbook. It was taught to millions of students. Why? First, the story was too good. It was dramatic. It had clear heroes and villains. It had shocking imagery. It told us something we wanted to believe or feared was true about human nature. Second, no one had thoroughly examined the archives. For decades, Zimbardo's papers sat at Stanford, essentially untouched by other researchers. Why? Was it lack of curiosity? Excessive respect for a tenured professor at a prestigious university? Access restrictions? Or was it simply that archival research is time-consuming work that doesn't advance careers? Whatever the reason, the archives remained sealed. And without access to the raw data, critics could only question methodology. They couldn't prove fraud. Third, Philip Zimbardo became the experiment's most effective promoter. He wrote best-selling books. He gave a TED Talk that has been viewed millions of times. He appeared on The Daily Show, on MSNBC, on panels with the Dalai Lama. He hosted a PBS series called Discovering Psychology. Zimbardo had a gift for storytelling. He could take complex social psychology and make it accessible, dramatic, relevant. And he had Stanford's prestige behind him. But there's a fourth reason the experiment survived. A reason that has nothing to do with science and everything to do with power. The Stanford Prison Experiment became useful. Useful to governments. Useful to militaries. Useful to institutions that needed to explain away atrocities. April 2004. Photographs emerge from Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. American soldiers torturing Iraqi detainees. Prisoners stripped naked, stacked in pyramids, threatened with dogs. Hooded figures standing on boxes, arms outstretched, wires attached to their bodies. The images shocked the world. The Bush administration scrambles for an explanation. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld calls it the work of a few bad apples. But others offer a different explanation. The power of the situation. Philip Zimbardo appears on every major news network. He draws direct parallels between Abu Ghraib and his Stanford experiment. The images from Abu Ghraib are virtually identical to what we saw in her basement at Stanford, Zimbardo tells reporters. Put good people in a bad situation, and the situation wins. The implication is clear. The soldiers at Abu Ghraib aren't monsters. They're normal people who fell into roles. They're victims of circumstance. The situation, not individual responsibility, is to blame. Zimbardo goes further. He testifies as an expert witness at the court-martial of Staff Sergeant Evan Chip, Frederick, one of the Abu Ghraib guards. His testimony: Frederick is guilty of the acts, but he's not responsible for them. The situation created by military leadership made the abuse inevitable. Frederick receives an 8-year prison sentence. But Zimbardo's involvement doesn't end there. He writes The Lucifer Effect, a best-selling book that explicitly links the Stanford Prison Experiment to Abu Ghraib. He argues that both demonstrate the same principle. Ordinary people, under the right circumstances, commit extraordinary evil. But there are problems with this narrative. First, the Stanford Prison Experiment was theater, not science. The guards were coached. The prisoners knew they could leave. There was extensive oversight: graduate students, visitors, a priest, psychologists, parents on visiting day. When guards pushed too far, experimenters intervened. Abu Ghraib was a war zone. There was no intervention. The abuse wasn't a role-playing exercise. It was real torture of real people in a real prison. Second, many of the Abu Ghraib perpetrators had histories of misconduct. They weren't randomly selected college students. They brought their own pathologies into the situation. Third, military investigations revealed that the abuse wasn't spontaneous. It was encouraged. Intelligence officers told military police to soften up detainees. There were explicit instructions to use sleep deprivation, stress positions, dogs for intimidation. The brutality wasn't situational. It was policy. But the Stanford Prison Experiment narrative was too useful. It allowed the military and the Bush administration to deflect blame. It wasn't policy failures or war crimes. It was just the inevitable result of putting people in prison roles. The real lesson of Abu Ghraib wasn't about situations. It was about accountability. About what happens when institutions create conditions for abuse and then refuse to take responsibility. About how scientific narratives can be weaponized to excuse atrocity. The Stanford Prison Experiment didn't just influence how we think about Abu Ghraib. It shaped how we understand human behavior across countless domains. Zimbardo testified before Congress about prison reform. His experiment was cited in arguments about solitary confinement, about juvenile detention, about the entire American criminal justice system. The military used the experiment in training programs. The Navy's survival, evasion, resistance, and escape program incorporated lessons from Stanford to teach soldiers about the psychology of captivity. Business schools taught the experiment to explain corporate misconduct. Political scientists used it to understand genocide and mass violence. Criminologists cited it in studies of police brutality. The experiment became a universal explanation. Whenever good people did bad things, we could point to the power of the situation. Individual responsibility faded. Structural accountability became optional. After all, if normal Stanford students could become sadistic guards in just days, what chance did anyone have to resist? But this narrative is dangerous. It removes agency. It suggests that under the right circumstances, we're all monsters waiting to emerge. It implies that resistance is futile. The reality is more complex. Yes, situations matter. Yes, institutional pressures influence behavior. But individuals still make choices. The guards at Stanford, who refused to abuse prisoners. The soldiers at Abu Ghraib, who reported the abuse. The people in every oppressive system who find ways to resist. The Stanford Prison Experiment doesn't prove that situations determine behavior. It proves that when researchers manipulate subjects, provide explicit instructions, and create demand characteristics, they can manufacture the results they want. In 2018, Thibault Letexier published his findings in American Psychologist, one of the field's most prestigious journals. His article, Debunking the Stanford Prison Experiment, laid out the evidence systematically. The guards received explicit instructions. The experiment borrowed heavily from an earlier student project. Participants were influenced by demand characteristics. The conclusions were written before the data was fully collected. Key findings were misrepresented in publications. The response from the psychology community was swift. Within weeks, researchers were calling for the experiment to be removed from textbooks. The University of California Davis psychologist Simon Vazire tweeted, "We must stop celebrating this work. It's anti-scientific. Get it out of textbooks?" Zimbardo defended himself. He published rebuttals. He questioned the Texier's methods. He insisted that the core findings remained valid. He pointed to other experiments that seemed to support his conclusions. But the dam had broken. Participants came forward. New documentaries were made. Journalists dug deeper. The full picture emerged. The Stanford Prison Experiment was not rigorous science. It was staged theater that was then presented as scientific truth. On October 14, 2024, Philip Zimbardo died at his home in San Francisco. He was 91 years old. The obituaries were mixed. Some celebrated his contributions to psychology. Others questioned his legacy. But one thing is clear. The Stanford Prison Experiment, as we understood it for 5 decades, was a myth. A powerful myth. A myth that shaped how we think about human nature, about institutions, about power. And myths have consequences. The story of the Stanford Prison Experiment is not really about prisons. It's not even really about psychology. It's about how narratives become truth. About how a prestigious institution, a charismatic researcher, and a compelling story can override scientific rigor. About how we sometimes prefer simple explanations to complex realities. It's about what happens when experiments become performances, when scientists become directors, when subjects become actors, and when the goal shifts from understanding to proving. The real lesson of the Stanford Prison Experiment is not that situations corrupt. It's that science can be corrupted, that data can be manipulated, that institutions can fail in their duty to question and verify. For 50 years, we cited this experiment to explain evil, to understand brutality, to grapple with why good people do bad things. But we were asking the wrong questions. The question isn't why the Stanford guards became cruel. We now know they were told to be cruel. They were coached. They were playing roles. The question is, why did we believe it for so long? Why did institutions fail to examine the evidence? Why did textbooks continue teaching flawed science? Why did courts cite this research in legal proceedings? And most importantly, what else have we accepted as truth without sufficient scrutiny? What other experiments, studies, and theories form the foundation of our understanding despite fundamental flaws? The Stanford Prison Experiment taught us something valuable, just not what Zimbardo intended. It taught us that we must question authority, especially scientific authority, that we must demand transparency, that we must look at the archives, read the original documents, talk to the participants. It taught us that the difference between science and theater is rigor, transparency, and honest reporting. That spectacular findings require spectacular evidence. That the burden of proof increases with the extraordinary nature of the claim. Tonight, we examined one experiment, one set of archives, one carefully constructed narrative that unraveled under scrutiny. But the Stanford Prison Experiment is not unique. It's not the only research that has been oversold, not the only study where methodology failed to match conclusions, not the only time charisma and prestige allowed flawed work to persist. The real experiment continues. It's happening right now in laboratories and universities around the world. The question is, are we learning? Are we becoming more skeptical, more rigorous, more willing to question? Or are we still too eager to believe stories that confirm what we already suspect about human nature? The Stanford Prison Experiment was supposed to reveal how easily we abandon our principles under pressure. Instead, it revealed how easily we abandon scientific principles when we find a narrative we like. That's the real lesson. That's what we should have been teaching all along. The truth was always there. In the archives, in the recordings, in the testimonies of participants who tried to tell us what really happened. We just weren't ready to listen. Until now. March 13, 1962. A memorandum lands on the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The document is classified top secret. Its title, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. What McNamara reads in that document will test every principle of American democracy. It is a detailed proposal from the nation's highest-ranking military officers. A blueprint for deception. A plan to wage war not against an enemy, but against the American people themselves. The plan calls for the United States government to commit acts of terrorism on its own soil, to hijack American planes, to sink American ships, to murder American civilians, and to blame it all on Cuba. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. This is a real document, signed by real generals, proposing real acts of violence against real Americans. For nearly 40 years, this document remained buried in classified files. The American people were never supposed to know it existed. The military leadership who created it expected it would be destroyed. They believed no one would ever discover what they had been willing to do. Tonight is not about theory. It's about what governments, scientists, and institutions were willing to do when they believed no one would ever find out. This is about documents buried in archives, plans that were approved at the highest levels, operations that were ready to execute. The most disturbing part is not that the plan existed, it's how detailed it was. To understand Operation Northwoods, you must first understand the world that created it. It is 1962. The Cold War is at its most dangerous. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Fidel Castro has established a communist government allied with the Soviet Union. 3 years earlier, Castro overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. He nationalized American businesses worth billions. He invited Soviet advisors. He made Cuba a Soviet foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The American military establishment views this as intolerable, an existential threat, a cancer that must be cut out before it metastasizes. In April 1961, the CIA launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, an attempt by Cuban exiles, trained and funded by the United States, to overthrow Castro. It was a catastrophic failure. Within 72 hours, Castro's forces had killed or captured nearly all of the invaders. President John F. Kennedy, just 3 months into his presidency, refused to provide American air support. He would not commit to use military forces to rescue the operation. The military leadership was furious. General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called Kennedy's refusal absolutely reprehensible, almost criminal. In the eyes of the generals, the young president was weak, indecisive, unwilling to do what was necessary. But the military was not ready to give up on Cuba. In November 1961, Kennedy authorized Operation Mongoose, a massive covert program to destabilize Castro's regime. The operation was led by Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, a legendary counterinsurgency specialist. Mongoose involved sabotage, economic warfare, propaganda, and attempts to assassinate Castro. But none of it was working. Castro remained in power. His security forces were too effective. The Cuban people, by and large, did not rise up, and Kennedy continued to resist calls for direct military intervention. That's when the Joint Chiefs of Staff decided to create their own solution. If Castro wouldn't give them a reason to invade, they would manufacture one. Operation Northwoods was not the work of rogue officers. It was not a low-level proposal that got out of hand. This plan was created, reviewed, and approved by the most senior military leadership in the United States. At the center was General Lyman Louis Lemnitzer. Born in 1899 in Huntsville, Pennsylvania, Lemnitzer graduated from West Point in 1920. He served in World War II, helping to negotiate the surrender of Italian forces in 1943. He rose through the ranks with distinction, eventually becoming Army Chief of Staff in 1959. In September 1960, President Dwight Eisenhower appointed him chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. At 61 years old, past the mandatory retirement age, Lemnitzer was allowed to remain on active duty, specifically to serve in this role. Lemnitzer was a hardline anti-communist. He believed civilian leadership was too soft, too political, too unwilling to use military force when necessary. He saw the world in stark terms: freedom versus tyranny, democracy versus communism. There was no room for nuance, no tolerance for compromise. Working under Lemnitzer was Brigadier General William H. Craig, chief of the JCS Cuba project. Craig was responsible for the detailed planning of operations against Castro. It was Craig who compiled the specific proposals that would become Operation Northwoods. But this wasn't just Lemnitzer and Craig. The document that emerged bore the signatures of all 5 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. Every single one of them approved the plan. This means the proposal had unanimous support from the nation's top military leadership. These were not fringe elements. These were the generals entrusted with defending American democracy, and they were proposing to attack it. On March 13, 1962, Lemnitzer went over the final details with General Craig and signed the document. That afternoon, he delivered it personally to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The document Lemnitzer presented was stamped top secret, not just classified, not just confidential. Top secret, the highest level of classification for information that, if disclosed, could cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. But even within the top secret classification, there are levels of control. Operation Northwoods was designated for limited distribution. This meant access was restricted to a tiny circle of individuals with specific need-to-know authorization. The Joint Chiefs were taking no chances. They knew what they were proposing was explosive, revolutionary. If it became public, the consequences would be catastrophic, not for national security, but for the military leadership itself. So extreme was the secrecy that after the Bay of Pigs disaster, Lemnitzer had ordered General David W. Gray to destroy all notes concerning Joint Chiefs' actions during that period. Gray's meticulous records were the only detailed official documentation of internal JCS discussions. Lemnitzer wanted them gone. He feared congressional investigation. He wanted the ability to deny, to obscure, to lie if necessary. With those records destroyed, Lemnitzer felt free to mislead Congress. When asked during secret Senate hearings if he knew of any Pentagon plans for a direct invasion of Cuba, he said he did not. It was a calculated lie. And with the documentation destroyed, there was no way to prove otherwise. This pattern of deception extended to Operation Northwoods itself. The plan was designed with plausible deniability built in. If operations were exposed, they could be blamed on Cuba. If the American involvement was suspected, it could be denied. The document itself could be destroyed. In fact, Lemnitzer probably believed all copies of Operation Northwoods had been destroyed. For 40 years, the plan remained completely hidden from the American public. No leaks, no whistleblowers, no congressional inquiries. When investigative journalist James Bamford began researching his book Body of Secrets in 2000, he obtained access to the declassified Operation Northwoods documents. What he found shocked him. According to secret and long-hidden documents, Bamford wrote, the Joint Chiefs of Staff drew up and approved plans for what may be the most corrupt plan ever created by the U.S. government. The plan wasn't vague. It wasn't theoretical. It was a detailed operational blueprint with specific tactics, timelines, and objectives. The document outlined 8 principal false flag operations attacks that would appear to be committed by Cuba, but would actually be carried out by American forces. The goal was to create public outrage, to manufacture consent for war. Here's what the Joint Chiefs proposed. First, create a communist Cuban terror campaign in Miami, other Florida cities, and even in Washington, D.C. The document specifically mentioned bombing civilian targets. government buildings, public spaces. The attacks would kill Americans. The evidence would point to Cuba. The plan stated, we could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances to be widely publicized. Read that again. Foster attempts on lives. Wounding in instances to be widely publicized. The Joint Chiefs were proposing to shoot real people to create propaganda. Second, stage coordinated incidents at the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. The plan called for a series of well-coordinated incidents to be planned around Guantanamo to give genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. These incidents included starting riots near the base gates, blowing up ammunition inside the base, burning aircraft on the airfield, sabotaging ship repair facilities, sinking a ship in the harbor entrance, and capturing Cuban saboteurs inside the base, who would actually be U.S. personnel in disguise. The document even suggested staging mock funerals for invented casualties to sell the deception to the public. Third, a Remember the Maine incident. This was a reference to the 1898 explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, which precipitated the Spanish-American War. Whether that explosion was an accident or sabotage remains debated, but it became a rallying cry for war. The Northwoods plan proposed blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay or Cuban waters and blaming it on Cuban mines or sabotage. The document stated we could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Casualty lists in newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. A helpful wave of national indignation. The military leadership was calculating how to manipulate American grief into support for war. Perhaps the most chilling proposals in Operation Northwoods involved civilian aircraft. The plan called for staging hijackings of civilian airliners. CIA operatives would board planes under assumed identities. Mid-flight, they would announce the plane was being hijacked to Cuba. The passengers would be terrified. The incident would be broadcast on radio. One version of this plan involved actually landing the plane in Cuba, then claiming the passengers had been taken hostage. Another version was even more elaborate. The document proposed creating a duplicate aircraft, an exact copy of a civilian passenger plane. This duplicate would be loaded with CIA operatives, posing as college students on a charter flight. The real plane, meanwhile, would be secretly loaded with different passengers, or perhaps no passengers at all. Here's how it would work. The duplicate aircraft would file a flight plan for a civilian route. It would take off. Mid-flight, it would broadcast a distress call, claiming it was under attack by Cuban MiG fighters. Then it would be destroyed, either by remote control or by a pre-planted bomb. Meanwhile, the real aircraft with the CIA operatives would land safely at a military base. The operatives would assume new identities. They would pretend to mourn their own deaths. To the American public, it would appear that Cuba had shot down a civilian airliner full of innocent Americans. The names of the victims would be published. Funerals would be held. Families see IA personnel, posing as relatives, would weep for the cameras. The document even addressed the need to manufacture aircraft debris and plant it in the ocean to be discovered by search teams. But there was another version, one that didn't involve duplicates or deception, one that acknowledged the possibility of real casualties. The plan stated, it is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area. At a designated time, A duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. Carefully prepared aliases. This wasn't just planning to fake deaths. This was planning to potentially cause real deaths while maintaining plausible deniability. The aircraft plans were just the beginning. The Northwoods document outlined a comprehensive strategy of deception that extended across multiple domains. Kidnappings and disappearances. The plan proposed staging the abduction of Cuban refugees in the United States. These kidnappings would be blamed on Cuban agents. In reality, U.S. operatives would conduct them. The victims might be willing participants, CIA assets playing roles. Or they might be unwitting pawns, actually abducted by their own government. The document suggested capturing Cuban saboteurs, who would of course be American personnel in disguise. These saboteurs could then be interrogated on camera, confessing to Castro's orders, providing evidence of Cuban aggression. Manufactured evidence. The plan called for creating false documentation to implicate Cuba in various crimes. Forged letters, fake communications intercepts, planted weapons with Cuban markings, fabricated Cuban government documents ordering attacks. The propaganda apparatus would be extensive. Staged interviews with defectors. News stories leaked to cooperative journalists. Congressional testimony from witnesses who were actually intelligence operatives. Attacks on neighboring countries. Operation Northwoods proposed faking Cuban aggression against other Latin American nations. U.S. operatives could bomb sites in Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, or other countries and plant evidence pointing to Cuba. This would build international support for military action. The document stated, we could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. Exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots, the arrest of Cuban agents, and the release of prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement also would be helpful in projecting the idea of an irresponsible government. Sinking refugee boats. Perhaps most disturbing was the proposal to sink boats carrying Cuban refugees fleeing to the United States. The plan specifically mentioned sinking a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. Real or simulated. That phrase appears throughout the document. It's bureaucratic language, concealing a horrifying reality. The military leadership was discussing the possibility of actually killing people as part of this operation. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation, the document repeated. The deaths of Americans, real Americans, were being calculated as propaganda value. Civilian collateral damage. The Northwoods planners understood that their operations might kill innocent people, and they were willing to accept that. The document discusses how to manage the public perception of casualties, how to frame them as martyrs, how to use their deaths to fuel war fever. James Bamford's assessment was stark. Code-named Operation Northwoods, the plan called for innocent people to be shot on American streets, for boats carrying refugees fleeing Cuba to be sunk on the high seas, for a wave of violent terrorism to be launched in Washington, D.C., Miami, and elsewhere. People would be framed for bombings they did not commit. Planes would be hijacked. Using phony evidence, all of it would be blamed on Castro. This was not the plan of fringe extremists. This was approved by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was American military leadership proposing to wage a secret war of terrorism against their own country. On the afternoon of March 13, 1962, General Lyman Lemnitzer met with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He presented the Operation Northwoods proposal. McNamara's immediate reaction is not recorded in any surviving document. But 3 days later, on March 16th, Lemnitzer attended a meeting with President Kennedy. What happened in that meeting is documented in a memorandum written by General Edward Lansdale, head of Operation Mongoose. According to Lansdale's notes, General Lemnitzer commented that the military had contingency plans for U.S. intervention. Also, it had plans for creating plausible pretexts to use force, with the pretext either attacks on U.S. aircraft or a Cuban action in Latin America for which we could retaliate. Kennedy's response was immediate and unequivocal. The president said bluntly that we were not discussing the use of military force, that General Lemnitzer might find the U.S. so engaged in Berlin or elsewhere that he couldn't use the contemplated 4 divisions in Cuba. It's not clear if Kennedy was briefed on the full details of Operation Northwoods. He may not have known about the plans to bomb American cities, to sink refugee boats, to stage hijackings. But he understood the essential premise. The military wanted to create false pretexts for war, and he shut it down. Not with discussion, not with negotiation, with a flat refusal. Why did Kennedy reject the plan? First, moral principle. Kennedy was willing to engage in covert operations. He approved assassination attempts against Castro. He authorized sabotage and economic warfare. But there was a line he would not cross. He would not approve attacks on American civilians. He would not turn the U.S. military against its own people. Second, political calculation. Kennedy had just survived the Bay of Pigs disaster. He had been burned by military and intelligence advice before. He had learned to be skeptical of plans that promised easy solutions through deception and force. The Bay of Pigs had taught him that military leadership could be reckless, that they would push for escalation regardless of consequences, and that once committed to a course of action, it was nearly impossible to pull back. Third, strategic judgment. Kennedy understood that any war with Cuba risked Soviet intervention. Cuba was 90 miles from Florida, but it was also a Soviet client state. If the United States invaded Cuba, the Soviet Union might respond in Berlin or Turkey or elsewhere. The risks of escalation were enormous. Just months later, in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis would prove Kennedy right. The world came within hours of nuclear war. Kennedy's refusal to approve military strikes on Cuba against intense pressure from the Joint Chiefs may have saved civilization. Fourth, a fundamental belief in civilian control of the military. Kennedy understood that Operation Northwoods represented more than just a bad plan. It represented a challenge to democratic governance itself. The military was proposing to manipulate the American people into supporting a war they had not chosen. In a democracy, the people are supposed to decide whether to go to war through their elected representatives, based on honest information. Operation Northwoods would have inverted that relationship. It would have made the American people pawns in a military deception. Kennedy said no, and in doing so, he may have saved American democracy from its own military. After Kennedy's rejection, Operation Northwoods died. No orders were given to proceed. No operations were launched. The document was filed away, classified top secret, locked in vaults. But there were consequences. General Lyman Lemnitzer's term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was set to expire in September 1962. Normally, successful chairmen were reappointed. Lemnitzer expected reappointment. Kennedy refused. Within months of the Northwoods proposal, Lemnitzer was denied another term as chairman. It was a professional humiliation, a clear signal of presidential displeasure. But Lemnitzer didn't disappear. In November 1962, he was appointed Supreme Allied Commander Europe for NATO. In theory, this was a lateral move. In practice, it was a demotion away to get him out of Washington and away from direct influence over U.S. military policy. Lemnitzer was replaced as chairman by General Maxwell Taylor, a Kennedy ally who shared the president's skepticism of military adventurism. The other members of the Joint Chiefs who had signed off on Northwoods remained in their positions. There was no public scandal, no investigation, no accountability beyond Lemnitzer's quiet removal. Operation Mongoose continued, but without the false flag component. The sabotage and assassination attempts against Castro persisted, but there would be no attacks on American soil. No manufactured incidents, no pretext for invasion. In October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. Soviet nuclear missiles were discovered in Cuba. For 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Throughout the crisis, the Joint Chiefs pushed Kennedy to launch airstrikes and invade Cuba. Kennedy refused. He chose blockade and negotiation instead. The crisis was resolved peacefully. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles. The United States pledged not to invade Cuba. In secret, Kennedy also agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. The Joint Chiefs viewed Kennedy's handling of the crisis as a betrayal. They believed he had shown weakness, that he had missed an opportunity to eliminate Castro once and for all. The relationship between Kennedy and his military leadership never recovered. There was deep mutual distrust. The generals saw Kennedy as dangerously naive. Kennedy saw the generals as dangerously reckless. 1 year after rejecting Operation Northwoods, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963. The declassified documents show no connection between Northwoods and the assassination. But the timing raises questions that have never been fully answered about the relationship between Kennedy and elements of the military intelligence establishment. In April 2001, investigative journalist James Bamford published Body of Secrets. The book exposed Operation Northwoods to the public for the first time in detail. The reaction was muted. One major news outlet, ABC News, covered the story. Reporter David Rupp wrote, U.S. military wanted to provoke war with Cuba, but most mainstream media ignored it. The documents were dismissed as ancient history, a Cold War relic, not relevant to modern America. But Operation Northwoods is profoundly relevant, not as a conspiracy theory, as documented fact. It proves beyond any doubt that the U.S. military leadership was willing to commit terrorism against American civilians to justify war, that they were willing to lie to the President, to Congress, to the American people, that they were willing to manufacture evidence, stage attacks, and kill innocents to achieve strategic objectives. This is not speculation. This is written in their own words, in official documents, signed by the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. military. The existence of Operation Northwoods raises uncomfortable questions. If the military was willing to propose this in 1962, what else have they proposed that we don't know about? How many other plans were developed, refined, and filed away in classified vaults? If the Joint Chiefs were willing to attack American civilians, what would stop similar thinking today? What safeguards exist to prevent such plans from being proposed, or worse, approved in future crises? The plan was rejected, yes, but it was rejected by one man, the President. It had the unanimous support of the Joint Chiefs. It had support from elements within the Pentagon. If a different president had been in office, or if Kennedy had been more susceptible to military pressure, Operation Northwoods might have been executed. Consider what that would have meant. Americans would have been killed by their own government. The deaths would have been blamed on Cuba. The nation would have been manipulated into war, and no one would have known the truth. For 40 years, no one did know. The plan remained secret. The American people had no idea how close they came to being victims of a massive false flag operation. Operation Northwoods demonstrates the critical importance of civilian control of the military, of checks and balances, of transparency and accountability. When military power operates in secret, without oversight, without democratic control, it can turn against the very people it's supposed to protect. The document also reveals the danger of extremism wrapped in patriotism. Lemnitzer and the Joint Chiefs believed they were defending America. They saw Castro as a threat so grave that any means, including terrorism against Americans, was justified to eliminate it. This is the logic of ends justifying means. It's a logic that erodes democracy from within, that replaces law with expediency. That substitutes military judgment for popular sovereignty. The Cold War, Two superpowers locked in a battle for global supremacy. We know about the nuclear arms race, the space race, the proxy wars. But there was another race. One conducted in the shadows, in hospital corridors, behind locked doors, on children who never knew they were soldiers in someone else's war. This is the story of experiments so horrific, so unethical, that governments tried to bury them for decades. This is the story of stolen childhoods, of erased memories, of lives destroyed in the name of national security. What you're about to hear is documented, real, and largely unknown. The files were supposed to be destroyed, but some survived, and they reveal a truth more disturbing than fiction. Montreal, Canada, 1957. On the slopes of Mount Royal stands a Victorian mansion. It's called Ravens Crag, beautiful, prestigious, home to the Allen Memorial Institute, McGill University's psychiatric hospital. To the outside world, this is a place of healing, a cutting-edge facility where the mentally ill come seeking help. Its director is one of the most respected psychiatrists in the world. His name is Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. Born in Scotland in 1901, Cameron is psychiatric royalty. He served as president of the American Psychiatric Association, president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, president of the World Psychiatric Association. When he speaks, the psychiatric community listens. Cameron believes he's found a cure for schizophrenia. He calls it psychic driving. The theory is simple, but brutal. If you can erase a person's existing memories completely, wipe the slate clean, you can rebuild their personality from scratch. A fresh start, a cure. But there's a problem. To erase memories, you have to break the mind first. This is where the horror begins. Cameron's method has a clinical name, depatterning. But there's nothing clinical about what it does to people. First, the drugs. Patients are placed in what Cameron calls the sleep room. They're given massive doses of barbiturates and sedatives, not for hours, for weeks, 30 days, 60 days, sometimes longer. They're woken only for feeding and bathroom breaks, 3 times a day. That's it. While they sleep, their bodies waste away. Medical notes from the time show patients losing 20-30 pounds, too weak to stand, muscles atrophying. But the sleep is just the beginning. When patients are unconscious enough, Cameron begins the electroshock therapy. Not the standard treatment of the era. No. Cameron uses something he calls intensive electroshock. 2 to 3 sessions per day, 150 volts, 6 seconds each time. But here's the innovation. Instead of the usual single shock, Cameron administers them in rapid succession. 20, 30, 40 shocks in a row. The goal is to induce amnesia. Complete, total amnesia. To reduce patients to what Cameron himself describes in his notes as a vegetable state. And he succeeds. Patients emerge from depatterning unable to recognize their own children, unable to remember their names, unable to control their bodily functions. Many have to be toilet trained again. They've been reduced to the mental state of infants. One patient, Zhang Steele, went in seeking treatment for postpartum depression. When she came out, her daughter said she was never the same woman again. Zhang would sit alone in the dark, write codes on the walls. Her emotions, her daughter later testified, were completely gone. Another patient went in as a successful businessman. He came out unable to remember his children's names, unable to run the business he built, his life erased. But depatterning was only phase 1. Phase 2 was repatterning, psychic driving. Cameron would tape record messages. Sometimes it was the patient's own voice, repeating negative statements they'd made about themselves. You are selfish. You are worthless. Over and over, for weeks. Then he'd switch to positive affirmations. You are lovable. You are capable. These messages would play on a loop, 16 hours a day, 20 hours, sometimes around the clock. all while patients were kept in sensory deprivation chambers or under the influence of paralytic drugs. The same message repeated 250,000 times, 500,000 times. The theory was that this would reprogram the mind, build a new personality, a healthy personality. The reality was torture. And here's what makes this story even darker. Cameron wasn't working alone. In 1957, Cameron received a grant. The money came through an organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Sounds academic, harmless. It wasn't. It was a CIA-front organization. The funding, $60,000 between 1957 and 1960, equivalent to over $500,000 today, came from a program with a code name, MKULTRA. Subproject 68.MKULTRA was the CIA's mind control program. Launched in 1953, at the height of Cold War paranoia, its goal was to develop techniques for interrogation, behavior modification, and psychological warfare. The agency had become convinced that the Soviets and Chinese had developed brainwashing techniques. They needed to catch up. To surpass them, they needed guinea pigs. And Cameron provided them. Did Cameron know he was working for the CIA? The evidence is mixed. The funding came through intermediaries, multiple cutouts. But correspondence later discovered between CIA officials shows they were specifically interested in his work. They saw potential in his methods, not for treating schizophrenia, but for breaking enemy agents, for extracting information, for creating what one internal memo described as reversible, non-toxic aberrant mental states. Reversible. That was the lie they told themselves. But it gets worse. Because Cameron wasn't just experimenting on adults seeking treatment for depression or anxiety. Children passed through the Allen Memorial Institute too. There's Lana Ponting, admitted at age 15 in 1958. Records show she underwent the patterning, treatments, LSD, electroshock, all without her informed consent. All without her parents truly understanding what was being done to their daughter. There's Esther Schreier, pregnant when she checked in for postpartum depression in February 1960. She spent 30 days in the sleep room. Lost 13 pounds. Medical notes show she was too weak to stand. The CIA funded her treatment. Her son, Lloyd Schreier, was exposed to these experiments in utero. He was born in the wake of his mother's treatment. Today, in his 60s, he still fights for recognition as an experiment victim. I will never know what I could have been, he says. How many children were experimented on? We don't know. Cameron kept meticulous notes, but those records were destroyed after his death in 1967 by his family. The CIA ordered most MKUltra files destroyed in 1973. What survives are fragments, testimony, financial records that slipped through the cracks. But what we do know is this. The techniques Cameron developed at the Allen Memorial Institute, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, intensive electroshock, psychic driving, became the foundation for CIA torture manuals. The Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation Handbook, declassified in 1997, draws directly from Cameron's work. These techniques were used at Guantanamo Bay, at Abu Ghraib. The legacy of the Allen Memorial Institute stretches across decades. And the victims? They got nothing, not for years. The experiments came to light in 1980 when the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's The Fifth Estate aired an investigation. Survivors spoke publicly for the first time. They described emerging from the Allen, unable to find their way back to the lives they'd lived. Families torn apart by divorce. Children placed in foster homes. The trauma rippling outward, spanning generations. Lawsuits followed. In 1988, 9 Canadian patients sued the CIA in U.S. courts and reached an out-of-court settlement. The CIA paid them, but accepted no liability. When it was revealed that the Canadian government had actually provided even more funding to Cameron than the CIA, over $500,000 between 1950 and 1965. Public pressure mounted. In 1994, the Canadian government offered compensation, $100,000 to each of 127 victims who met strict criteria. But it came with a catch. Canada took no legal responsibility. The compensation was framed as humanitarian, not an admission of wrongdoing. And that was supposed to be the end of it. But more than 250 people were denied compensation. Their medical records had been destroyed. They filed too late. Or, in the government's assessment, they hadn't suffered enough. For decades, they've been fighting. New lawsuits, class actions. In 2017, one victim's daughter received a settlement from the Canadian government. But she had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, a gag order. The government was still trying to keep people quiet. In July 2025, just months ago, a Quebec Superior Court judge authorized a class action lawsuit on behalf of all people who underwent depatterning at the Allen Memorial Institute between 1948 and 1964. Julie, Tanny, and Lana Pontiang were granted the right to represent potentially hundreds of victims and their families. The defendants, the Royal Victoria Hospital, McGill University, and the Government of Canada. Today, portraits of Cameron still hang in the halls of the Allen Memorial Institute. McGill University has offered no apology. Neither has the Canadian government. Neither has the CIA. The experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute represent one of the darkest chapters in psychiatric history. Children and vulnerable adults seeking help were subjected to torture in the name of science. Their minds shattered. Their lives destroyed. And it didn't just happen in Canada. While Cameron conducted his experiments in Montreal, similar horrors were unfolding across North America. The program was MKUltra, and it was vast. Over 20 years, from 1953 to 1973, the CIA funded 149 subprojects. At least 44 universities participated, 15 private research facilities, 12 hospitals and clinics, 3 penal institutions. The total budget exceeded $25 million, hundreds of millions in today's money. The goal remained the same: to develop methods of behavior control, mind control, to find drugs and techniques that could break a person's will, make them tell secrets, make them forget, make them do things against their own nature. And once again, the most vulnerable were the primary targets. Let's start with the children in institutions. Bordentown Reformatory, New Jersey. 1950s and 60s. It's a juvenile detention facility. The kids here are teenagers, sent for minor offenses, truancy, petty theft, behavioral issues. They're hoping for rehabilitation, a second chance. Instead, they become test subjects for MKUltra Subproject 112. Dr. Carl Pfeiffer runs the program. The goal, according to declassified CIA documents, is to study juvenile delinquents and their responses to psychoactive drugs. The researchers administer LSD, doses of 50 to 200 micrograms. The goal is to induce what the reports call transient psychotic states. These are children, minors. The CIA is giving them hallucinogenic drugs without informed consent to see how their minds react. Imagine a 16-year-old locked up for truancy, suddenly experiencing LSD-induced hallucinations, paranoia, terror, no understanding of what's happening or why. The effects of LSD can be devastating for adults. For teenagers whose brains are still developing, the risks include permanent memory problems, anxiety disorders, psychological trauma that lasts a lifetime. The experiments are documented. The CIA's own files confirm it. But for decades, this was hidden, classified, too sensitive. Bordentown wasn't alone. Reports and testimonies suggest similar experiments at orphanages, at the Laurel Children's Center in Maryland, at facilities across the country where children had no parents to protect them, no advocates, no voice. In Quebec, Canada, there's an even more disturbing chapter. The Duplessis orphans. During the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, Quebec's government, in cooperation with the Catholic Church, ran a network of orphanages. Thousands of children passed through these institutions. Many were falsely diagnosed as mentally ill, a reclassification that brought in more federal funding when they were transferred to psychiatric facilities. Once labeled as psychiatric patients, these children became available for experimentation. Survivors report being subjected to experimental drugs, lobotomies, and electroshock therapy. Some report CIA involvement. Author Anne Diamond and researcher Rod Vanneau have documented connections between Quebec's orphanages and MK-Ultra experiments. Within 6 months of CIA Director Alan Dulles signing MK-Ultra into existence in 1953, thousands of Quebec orphans were being drugged, lobotomized, and tortured. One survivor, Terry Parker Jr., was lobotomized and brain implanted at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children without his parents' knowledge or consent. He later testified about the horrors he endured. Over 100,000 children were exploited in what became known as the Duplessis orphan scandal. To this day, survivors are still fighting for recognition and compensation. And then there's the research at universities. Stanford University, Harvard University. Universities across the country participated in MK-ULTR, subprojects. Some knowingly, some not. Graduate students and undergraduates were recruited as test subjects. Many were told the experiments were about learning or stress response. They weren't told they were being dosed with LSD or other psychoactive substances. Ken Kesey, who would later write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was a volunteer subject at Stanford. He knew he was taking LSD, but not all volunteers were so informed. At Harvard, a young undergraduate named Theodore Kaczynski participated in a psychological experiment run by Professor Henry Murray. Kaczynski was subjected to intensive, abusive psychological interrogation designed to attack his fundamental beliefs and identity. Murray was an MK-Ultra researcher. Years later, Kaczynski would become known as the Unabomber. While his crimes were his own responsibility, researchers have pointed to his time in Murray's experiments as a potential contributing factor to his psychological deterioration. But the universities pale in comparison to what happened in prisons and psychiatric hospitals. Prisoners were considered ideal subjects. They were contained, controlled, and desperate. The CIA and military researchers offered them incentives, commuted sentences, extra recreation time, money. In exchange, prisoners agreed to be test subjects. But consent is a problematic concept when someone is incarcerated. At the Federal Narcotics Farm in Lexington, Kentucky, heroin addicts were used as test subjects for years. They were offered more heroin in exchange for taking LSD and other experimental drugs. The experiments continued for over a decade. In psychiatric hospitals across America, patients, many of whom couldn't consent, were subjected to experiments. They were already hospitalized, already vulnerable. As Sidney Gottlieb, head of MK-Ultra, coldly testified to Congress, when you say hospitalization, the people were already hospitalized. In his mind, this somehow made it acceptable. One of the most infamous cases is Harold Blower, a professional tennis player who checked himself into New York State Psychiatric Institute in 1952 for treatment of depression following a divorce. Without his knowledge or informed consent, Blower was injected with a fatal dose of MDA, a psychoactive drug, as part of a military experiment. He died. The U.S. Department of Defense, which sponsored the injection, worked with the Department of Justice to conceal evidence of its involvement for 23 years. Indigenous children were also targeted. In the 1950s and 60s, evidence suggests that Indigenous children in Montreal were subjected to electroshock, hallucinogenic drugs, and sensory deprivation as part of MKULTRA experiments. Mohawk Mothers, an indigenous rights group, has been fighting to search the grounds of the former Royal Victoria Hospital and Allen Memorial Institute. They believe unmarked graves may contain the remains of children who died during or as a result of these experiments. In 2021, a Danish documentary titled The Search for Myself revealed that the CIA had financially aided experiments on 311 Danish children in the early 1960s. Many were orphans or adopted children. The experiments were conducted without their knowledge or consent. Across continents, the pattern was the same. Find the vulnerable, the voiceless, the ones no one would miss or believe, experiment on them, and hide the evidence. In the United Kingdom, the psychiatrist William Sargant was conducting similar experiments. At St. Thomas Hospital in London and Belmont Hospital in Sutton, Sargant experimented on patients without their consent. His work paralleled Cameron's: deep sleep treatment, insulin-induced comas, electroshock therapy. Sargant acted as a consultant for MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence service. While there's no definitive proof his work was directly funded by intelligence services, the parallels to CIA-funded experiments are striking. And Sargant's methods left similar destruction in their wake. Patients suffering long-term damage, families torn apart, lives ruined. The scope of MKUltra was staggering. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. Most of the records were deliberately destroyed. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal unfolded and government accountability suddenly seemed possible, CIA Director Richard Helms gave an order: destroy all MKUltra files, and they did. Most of them, by pure chance, about 20,000 pages survived. Financial records, incorrectly stored in a budget office, escaped destruction. When they were discovered in 1977, following a Freedom of Information Act request, they provided a glimpse into the program's true scope. But the detailed operational records, the names of most test subjects, the specifics of what was done to them, the results were gone, burned, shredded, lost, which means the full truth of MKUltra will never be known. How many children were experimented on? How many lives were destroyed? How many people died or permanently damaged? We can only count the survivors who've come forward. And even then, many have been silenced by non-disclosure agreements, shame, trauma, or simple disbelief. The experiments violated every ethical principle in medicine. They violated the Nuremberg Code, established after World War II, specifically to prevent the kind of human experimentation the Nazis had conducted. The United States had helped prosecute Nazi doctors at Nuremberg. The standard was clear. Voluntary, informed consent is absolutely essential. And yet, less than a decade later, the CIA was conducting experiments on unwitting American citizens, including children, that violated every principle the Nuremberg trials established. The hypocrisy is staggering. December 22, 1974. The New York Times publishes a front-page article by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh. The headline reveals that the CIA has conducted illegal domestic activities, including experiments on U.S. citizens. The public is shocked. Congress is forced to act. On January 27, 1975, the U.S. Senate votes 82-4 to create the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. It becomes known as the Church Committee, named for its chairman, Senator Frank Church of Idaho. For the first time since 1945, Congress investigates the intelligence community. What they find is damning. Over the course of 1975, the Church Committee uncovers Operation MKUltra, Operation Chaos, a domestic surveillance program; COINTELPRO, the FBI's program to infiltrate and disrupt civil rights organizations; Projects Shamrock and Minaret, massive illegal surveillance programs by the NSA. In September 1975, Senator Church appears on NBC's Meet the Press. He holds up a a poison dart gun, a weapon designed for assassination. His words are chilling. I don't want to see this country ever cross the bridge. I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America. We must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision so that we never cross over that abyss. That is the abyss from which there is no return. The Church Committee's final report is published in April 1976. 6 volumes. 7 volumes of hearing transcripts. Thousands of pages detailing abuses by the intelligence community. But there's a problem. Most of MKUltra's operational files were destroyed in 1973. The committee has to rely on testimony from participants and the small cache of financial records that survived. In July 1977, another breakthrough. The CIA discovers 7 boxes of documents that had been missed during the 1973 purge. They contain additional financial records related to MKUltra. Senator Daniel Inouye convenes joint hearings with Senator Edward Kennedy's Subcommittee on Health. On August 3, 1977, CIA Director Stansfield Turner testifies before Congress. He reveals more details about MKUltra. He admits to the use of universities, prisons, and hospitals. He describes experiments involving LSD, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and psychological torture. But Turner also distances the CIA from its own past. The experiments, he says, ended in 1973. They don't represent current agency policy. The officials involved are long retired. The message is clear. This was the past. We've moved on. Except the victims haven't moved on. Because they can't. In October 1975, just months before the Church Committee's final report, Sidney Gottlieb testifies in secret session. The transcripts remain classified for 50 years. When they're finally released in October 2025, they confirm what survivors have been saying all along. Gottlieb admits the experiments were extensive. Universities, hospitals, mental institutions, prisons. A lot of these things were done in hospitals and mental institutions, he says. And when you say hospitalization, the people were already hospitalized. His tone is clinical, detached. There's no hint of remorse, no acknowledgement of the human cost. When asked if the experiments produced useful intelligence results, Gottlieb's assessment is brutal in its honesty. As many failures as successes, the results were unpredictable. The security risks, the money spent, the effort involved. When you added it up, he said, it was probably not a high payoff program. Hundreds of lives destroyed, children traumatized, people driven insane, families torn apart. For what Gottlieb calls probably not a high payoff program. But the revelations led to some action. In 1975, the family of Dr. Frank Olson, an Army scientist who died in 1953 after being unwittingly dosed with LSD by Gottlieb, received a $750,000 settlement from the U.S. government. President Gerald Ford and CIA Director William Colby formally apologized. But the apology was limited. It covered only the issue of informed consent, not the broader program of experimentation. Ford issued Executive Order 11,905, which banned political assassinations. President Jimmy Carter later expanded these restrictions with Executive Order 12,036. Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978, creating judicial oversight for intelligence gathering. These were important reforms. But for MKUltra's victims, they came too late. Legal accountability has been nearly impossible to achieve. In the 1980s, 9 Canadians who were experimented on by Cameron sued the CIA in U.S. courts. After years of litigation, they reached an out-of-court settlement in 1988. Each received $67,000, less than $100,000 in today's dollars, for lives destroyed. The CIA accepted no liability. Other lawsuits have failed. In 2005, Wayne Ritchie, a former U.S. Marshal, sued the CIA, claiming he'd been drugged with LSD at a 1957 Christmas party. While the government admitted it was drugging people without consent at that time, the court dismissed his case. He couldn't prove he was specifically an MKUltra victim. The evidentiary burden was too high. In Canada, the pattern is the same. Some compensation, but no accountability. The Canadian government's 1994 compensation program paid $100,000 to 127 verified victims of Cameron's experiments. But more than 250 claims were denied. Medical records had been destroyed. People filed too late. Or they couldn't prove they'd been harmed enough. In 2017, one victim's daughter received a settlement, but only after signing a non-disclosure agreement. The government paid for silence. In 2024 and 2025, survivors continued fighting. New class action lawsuits were filed. In July 2025, a Quebec court authorized a class action on behalf of all Cameron's victims. The case is ongoing. But here's the frustrating reality. Canada and the United States have never admitted liability, never issued a formal public apology for what was done. McGill University says Cameron acted independently. The Royal Victoria Hospital says he wasn't technically their employee. The Canadian government says they provided funding for humanitarian reasons, not knowing the details of the experiments, a claim contradicted by documentary evidence. The United States invokes state immunity when sued in Canadian courts. In U.S. courts, the CIA hides behind national security classifications and evidentiary requirements that are nearly impossible to meet. The result is that most victims and their families receive nothing. No acknowledgement, no apology, no compensation. Just decades of trauma and the knowledge that their governments experimented on them and walked away. Why does this matter? Why should we care about events from 50, 60, 70 years ago? Because the legacy of these experiments didn't end in 1973. The techniques developed through MKUltra sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, stress positions, isolation became the foundation for modern enhanced interrogation techniques. The CIA's Kubark Manual, written in 1963 and declassified in 1997, explicitly draws on MKUltra research. These techniques were taught at the School of the Americas to Latin American paramilitary groups. They were used at Guantanamo Bay, at Abu Ghraib, at CIA black sites around the world. The justification was the same: national security, the war on terror, protecting America. But the roots trace back to Montreal, to Bordentown, to psychiatric hospitals where children and vulnerable adults were experimented on without consent. The other reason it matters is this: it happened. It was real. And if we don't remember it, if we don't demand accountability, there's nothing to stop it from happening again. Frank Church understood this in 1975. His warning about never crossing the bridge to tyranny wasn't hyperbole. It was a recognition that governments, when operating in secret and without oversight, will commit atrocities. The victims of MKUltra have spent decades trying to make people understand what was done to them. Many have been dismissed as conspiracy theorists, told they're exaggerating, told to move on. But they're not exaggerating. The documents prove it. The declassified files, the testimony, the medical records that survived, they all confirm the horror. Gina Blasbog, who became a patient at the Allen Memorial Institute as a teenager in 1959, has been fighting for decades. The government should offer an apology, and there should be recognition of the injustice that was done, she says. Lloyd Schreier, whose mother was experimented on while pregnant with him, says, "I think they should come out and just deal with it." I don't think it's right. Julie Tanney, whose father Charles was permanently damaged by Cameron's experiments, filed a class action lawsuit in 2019. She's still fighting, still seeking justice for her father and hundreds of others. These are not conspiracy theorists. They're survivors. They're family members. They're people seeking basic acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. And that acknowledgement has largely been denied. In 2017, Canada's Justice Minister cited the 1980s inquiry into Cameron, which concluded Canada held no legal liability. The government's position: compensation was paid for humanitarian reasons, not because of legal responsibility. McGill University has said that research ethics have evolved considerably since the 1960s. Indirect way of acknowledging that what Cameron did wouldn't be allowed today, while still avoiding accountability for enabling it then. The CIA has never apologized, never admitted wrongdoing beyond the narrow issue of informed consent in a handful of specific cases. The children experimented on at Bordentown, in Quebec's orphanages, at psychiatric hospitals across North America, at McGill. Most of them have received nothing. Many are dead now. Others are elderly, still fighting, still seeking recognition. The truth is this: Operation Ultra happened. Children were experimented on. Lives were destroyed. Families were torn apart. And the governments and institutions responsible have largely escaped accountability. The experiments violated medical ethics. They violated the Nuremberg Code. They violated basic human rights. They violated the trust of people who came seeking help and instead found torture. This isn't ancient history. Many victims are still alive. The class action lawsuits are ongoing. The fight for justice continues. And the techniques developed through these experiments are still in use today. We began with a simple question: what did governments do to children during the Cold War? The answer is documented, real, horrifying, from Montreal to New Jersey, from Quebec to California, from Denmark to indigenous communities in Canada. Children and vulnerable adults were used as test subjects in experiments that violated every ethical standard in medicine. They were given LSD without their knowledge, subjected to intensive electroshock, held in sensory deprivation, reduced to vegetable states, their memories erased, their personalities shattered. The justification was always the same: national security, the Soviet threat, the need to keep pace in the Cold War. But national security cannot justify torture. And make no mistake, what was done to these people was torture. The experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute, at Bordentown, in orphanages and psychiatric hospitals across North America, were torture. Systematic, deliberate, documented torture. And it was funded by the CIA, by the Canadian government, by universities, by hospitals, by institutions that were supposed to protect the vulnerable, not experiment on them. The files were supposed to be destroyed, but some survived. And they tell a story of institutional cruelty, of government secrecy, of ethics abandoned in the name of Cold War paranoia. The victims have been fighting for decades. Most have received nothing, no acknowledgement, no apology, no compensation. Just the trauma of what was done to them and the knowledge that their governments got away with it. Why does almost nobody know this story? Because it was classified. Because records were destroyed. Because survivors were silenced with gag orders. Because it's easier to forget uncomfortable truths than to confront them. But these experiments happened. They're documented. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron's portrait still hangs in the Allen Memorial Institute. McGill University has never apologized. The Canadian government has never admitted liability. The CIA has never acknowledged the full scope of its human experimentation program. The techniques developed through MK-Ultra are still used today at Guantanamo, at CIA black sites, in interrogation programs around the world. The legacy of these experiments continues. Frank Church warned us in 1975 about the abyss, about the capacity for tyranny when governments operate in secret, without oversight, without accountability. The story of MK-Ultra is proof that he was right. These weren't rogue scientists. This was institutional, systematic, funded at the highest levels, hidden from Congress, hidden from the public, hidden from the victims themselves. And when it was exposed, the response was to destroy evidence, deny responsibility, and wait for the survivors to die. But they haven't all died yet, and some are still fighting. The least we can do is remember, to bear witness to what was done, to say their names, to acknowledge their suffering. Jean Steele, Charles Tenney, Esther Schreier, Lloyd Schreier, Gina Blasbog, Anna Ponting, Harold Blauer, Frank Olson, the Duplessis orphans, the children at Bordentown, the 311 Danish children, the indigenous children in Montreal, and the hundreds, perhaps thousands, of others whose names we'll never know because their records were destroyed. This is their story, the story of stolen children, of stolen lives, of experiments conducted in secret in the name of national security that destroyed the people they were supposed to protect. It happened. It's documented. It's real. And we must never forget. Because Frank Church was right. There is an abyss. And once we cross it, there's no return. The children experimented on in the Cold War were thrown into that abyss. Many never made it back. The question now is, will we remember them? Will we demand accountability? Will we ensure it never happens again? Or will we look away, forget, and allow history to repeat itself? The documents are there. The survivors are there. The truth is there. The only question is whether we have the courage to face it. This has been the story of stolen children. Secret Cold War experiments on minors. A story of institutional betrayal, government cover-up, and the fight for justice that continues to this day. The files were supposed to be destroyed, but some survived, and they tell us everything.